Hello, and welcome to another Glasshouse session. Today is the first time back after Hacker Summer Camp, so I hope everyone is rested and mostly COVID-free. There's been quite a lot of cyber stuff, most of which we're going to skip over because we have a special guest, Ciaran Martin, who is the man responsible for adjusting the laws that govern the succession of the monarchy. So it used to be that only the male heir could become the monarch, and now it can go to either sex. So that is, very exciting. We're looking forward to that discussion.
High impact stuff, given that it's fixed for the next 100 years on the male line. But there you go.
We went over when I was in high school. They did this whole section on the British monarchy, and I got an F. I just want to say that. I had no idea what was happening. It made no sense to me. And
There's
to this
only
day, that's true.
It's like Richard, George. There's another one.
I didn't realize there were multiple countries in the UK till very recently.
Touchy subject. I think the Grug hosts an other session on that.
Yeah. Yeah, the Scottish have opinions.
I just like to come to these things with just a bevy of excited ignorance, and I just, unload that on our invited guests.
I wanna bang through some stuff quickly that happened. So there's iOS O days, but we know nothing about them. There was a DDoS against Estonia, which was a non-event, but it's got more attention than it deserved. Some water utility got hacked, but it wasn't in an important way, and no one's going to care or do anything about it. There's a lot of confusion and jokes made about a bill about government purchases of software and CVEs, and then Katie showed up and made everyone shut up by laying down some knowledge. SickCodes has hacked tractors, which is cool. DEFCON happened. Wagner group found out that if you post the address of your headquarters, it gets exploded. So that was amusing. There's a whole bunch of stuff happening with iOS lockdown, and Tornado Cash got sanctioned, so now crypto is safe. That's it. That's all that's happened in cyber. So back to the succession, and whether Scotland is a country or a conspiracy of cartographers.
Well, we should give a bio. Let's do a bio.
You know what? I'm going to cheat. Dave, would you like to do the bio?
Well, I guess our invited guests. And am I pronouncing your name right? I pronounce it Ciaran in my head.
Ciaran. That's fine.
Ciaran. All right.
I got it all.
Just remember that he's from Tyrone.
Tyrone.
Yeah, Ty.
Nah, no.
Heavy on the I.
All right. So I guess I would say, first of all, it's very hard to get a clear bio for people who've been in government service often, because a good bio does not say the real accomplishments of someone who's been in government service the way you have. But your particular bio is essentially revolutionizing, as part of the UK government, to a more what you call interventionist posture in cyber, as part of creating the NCSC in 2016, which you then led, right? This is all very big stuff, right? But I also think the big stuff doesn't really cover all you the scope of your role, the influence, and what your background, where you come from. So some of my first questions were why are you even in cyber? What got you into cyber in the first place? That would probably be my first question, to find out, where's the core?
It was kind of accidental, and truthfully, I sort of argued partly against my own appointment. I was kind of a career bureaucrat in the center of the British government, mostly doing policy stuff, constitutional stuff, weird stuff like getting consent from 17 different countries to change the royal succession laws, Scottish referendum negotiations, some Treasury Department work. But in the mid to late 2000s, I ended up doing a lot of what we would now call intelligence policy. which involved, so in the UK system for the first, the security agencies were mostly founded around 1909. And for the first sort of 80 years of their existence, officially denied, no transparent legal basis. So, you couldn't sue them and couldn't have any form of redress. That changed. Then after 9/11 and all the sort of Guantanamo type operations, various groups started to take various forms of action against the intelligence services, and there was no framework for having sort of court discovery of secret material, that sort of thing. So I ended up running policy on that because it was kind of a sort of constitutional issue, which meant getting high-level security clearance, working really closely with the agencies. The agency that wasn't much involved in that in our system was GCHQ because, it was a SIGINT agency. It wasn't involved in interrogation of detainees. It's isolated from London because it's not in London and so on. And then, so I left that job, was doing constitutional stuff, and then Snowden hit. And GCHQ, unlike the other agencies, didn't really have a public policy function. It had a small press office that was basically around its status as the biggest employer in Cheltenham, so about sort of, town events and that sort of thing. And all of a sudden, its press office was getting calls from not just every British press, but Der Spiegel and the Washington Post and everything else. Parliament was scrutinizing all of its powers and asking really difficult questions. So the sort of transformation of that happened, say, MI5 and MI6 of opening up a bit, having more accountability, having fresh laws, which took maybe 3 to 5 years, happened basically in a day. The trigger for that, because Snowden was so sudden and it was beyond the sort of black swan, if you like, concept. It was just so much worse than anybody thought it would be. So they were looking at people who could come and help them with that sort of aftermath, and asked for me because I'd worked with them before. But they said, look, in the long term, because it involved moving house and so forth and building a career, they said you could run the cybersecurity operation. I remember talking to a friend that I've known since I was 4, went to primary school with him. I said, what about this? He said, well, what do you know about computers? Which was my actual answer. I'm slightly intimidated by this crew because you're all so technically expert, and I genuinely mean that. But I ended up...
very briefly, this sounds exactly the way that government works.
It is.
They go, you know what, we need a cyber person. Why don't we get the guy who did the succession for the monarchy? He seems nice.
That's kind of what I said. And actually, the stuff around the public policy and the aftermath, the legal basis for SIGINT operations and so on post Snowden, that was something I did understand. The stuff around safely entering into public debate about what the agency did. I mean, again, I could understand that. The cyber thing I was genuinely scared of. There were some really, really brilliant technical and operational experts there. I spent kind of the first year after the sort of Snowden fire started to be put out, just frankly listening to them, trying to learn from them. I was never going to be anywhere. I was never going to acquire technical competence, but in a sense, what they were sort of saying was, look, and this is the bit about trying to transform the way we did stuff. They were saying, look, we've got a bunch of expertise here, but we're trying the same thing over and over again. So, for example, back then, and it took me about a year to figure this out, every strategy, both in the US and the UK, was let's do information sharing and public-private partnerships. That was it. I mean, that was the boilerplate cybersecurity strategy of all Western governments for the first 15 years of this century, right? So I remember asking them once at a meeting in some point late 2014 or something. I said, look, I've just been to this conference in Georgetown, in Washington. And again, it was like, let's more information sharing, public-private partnerships. So I was sort of saying, look, what do you guys think? Because it strikes me you've been doing this for ages, and I'm no expert, but should we not try something else? And there's this sort of collective exhalation of breath saying, and I thought, oh God, have I just, do I smell or something? But they said, look, we're actually really glad you said that because we've got a whole bunch of ideas about doing things differently. Why is threat intel basically, for example, functioning well as a market? And if you want to do that, you can do things. But if you want to do, if you want to counter domain name spoofing, nobody has a clue what to do, etc., etc. So there's a bunch of things going on in British politics at the time, which I won't reprise because it would take the whole hour, about, look, can we have some radical ideas on doing cybersecurity because we're not happy with where we are? So you put that together, you got me who's used to talking to the policy system, you've got these guys. By this stage, I've learned enough to understand what they're telling me. And so we worked out a bunch of things. I remember we sent a paper in with 15 ideas and we said, not all of these will work and we don't have the capacity to try all of them. But, doing DMARC on all government domains, why don't we try that? Doing DNS filtering for public sector websites, why don't we try that? And so we just put, and then, the sort of the NCSC construct was, well, you've got to, you've got to become, GCHQ always had, just like the NSA, it always had a sort of InfoSec function, but it was geared towards high-end defense and intelligence assets. So, protecting, the Bletchley stuff, break and protect code in wartime. It's basically what it was configured to do. And when it's not wartime, prepare for that. Now it's like an advisory sort of thing to the entire country. So that can range from, password guidance in schools. And you go to British schools these days, and they do have the NCSE password guidance up on the wall for the kids, all the way through to, resilience and energy plants and so forth. So you do that and you say, well, can you do that from an organization 100 miles from London that's behind barbed wire with no cell phones? No, you can't. So the NCC construct that we came up with was hybrid. You do need all the SIGINT, you need all the data, all the telemetry, you need all the skilled people who won't want to work for a sort of non-GCHQ agency. But you do a hybrid. So GCHQ is under a legal obligation to be secret unless there's an overwhelming public interest in telling the world something. You reverse that presumption for cybersecurity, and you say, look, there are some stuff you need to be secret, but otherwise you default, just like any other public authority, you default to openness. So we build a new place in London. It's a mixture of classified working space and non-classified working space, and you do things. And actually, you sort of talk about risks. One of the risks that we took that through a mixture of luck and I hope a bit of judgment never materialized in my time nor since. We started, like, if you take Russian APTs, we started basically declassifying loads of IOCs and stuff like that and just putting them on the website and thinking, I remember saying to politicians at the time, inevitably we'll get some of this wrong and we'll declassify some stuff that shouldn't be declassified. And at that point, that's where we need you to stick with us, because broadly it will be a benefit, but we'll make mistakes. We didn't make, thankfully, any serious mistakes to the best of my knowledge, and accidentally declassify something. So we started to do stuff like that. So in a sense, I became a sort of, middle point between between a sort of center of government, which, like all center of governments, and I'm not criticizing this, doesn't understand the topic, and deep technical experts who don't understand the center of government. And that's basically where I positioned myself, and that's how I got into it.
One of the strengths, I think, in your resume is understanding how alliances work, which is, for me, it's very weird when you get and now international relations papers or whatever that analyze, like, for example, the strength of particular countries against each other in cyber or whatever, right? Like, right. You get all sorts of things, but each country really works as part of a very complicated alliance network. Do you find this, I don't know, where do you sit with these sorts of discussions?
You mean in terms of partners and stuff? And
well, I guess, like, for me, it's sort of like, if I was in the UK, I would be asking questions like, how do we structure ourselves so that we're best part of our larger alliances when it comes to cyber capabilities? Do we focus and, like, become like an arm? You know what I mean? Or are we spread out and, like, we try to cover everything, but just a little bit? There's a lot of weird questions.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of the reasons for putting it in GCHQ was just, the Five Eyes construct is institutional. So, you set up a new cybersecurity authority. There's no guarantee. In fact, I assume the presumption would be against the NSA having the deep integration and cooperation with that than you would have with a part of GCHQ. I think the other thing that we tried to do, the private sector stuff was really interesting. All governments have a not invented here and, to some degree, an inbuilt distrust of the private sector. We tried to go against that, and I don't claim any credit for this. It was mostly, people like the Director of Operations, Paul Chichester, and the Tech Director, Ian Levy. They had these really, really deeply ingrained global private sector relationships. And, and they kept saying that, there was parts of the stuff that wasn't commercially sort of interesting for the companies, but they were happy to help government with, and B, that there was a sort of public spiritedness about quite a lot of it, but was genuinely true. So one of the things that was really interesting, if you take Cloud Hopper attribution in the end of 2018, so if you look at the British government's formal papers in Cloud Hopper attribution, they are formally badged with two private sector companies, PwC and BAE Applied Intelligence. And the reason for that, and this isn't a secret, the reason for that was they'd been working on stuff, on the detection of Cloud Hopper, and they came to us and said, basically a sort of almost responsible disclosure thing. They said, look, are we causing trouble if if we put this out? And we said, well, thank you for approaching us. You will if you do it right now. if you wait a bit, we're working on it too. We have more stuff than you because we're the government. We should have, but if you work with us, we'll do it jointly, and we did it. So it was really sort of it was quite interesting, and again, it's sort of interesting bits, cautious lawyers, and I mean that respectfully, would say, well, you want to be careful because you the accusations of favoritism and so on, and special relationships with companies and so forth. Actually, they didn't really care. We didn't come close to being sort of sued or protested about some of these, sort of coalitions of the willing. The other thing just about the international bit, I mean, the Five Eyes doctrine is supposed to be the UK-US doctrine is supposed to be that everybody tries to have capability in pretty much everything. Now for the UK, it's obviously a lot harder to maintain than the US. So we didn't go down the niche sort of bit. We did, however, do something with some success and some failures about going beyond it. And what's if you take continental Europe, and obviously the UK's relationship with continental Europe was tumultuous throughout most of this period. But continental Europe, just for mostly historical reasons, doesn't have cybersecurity agencies in the deep state. It has them in sort of civilian agencies with a relationship with it. But and so we thought that doing that through an arm of GCHQ would be harder than it actually was. But intelligence sharing gets you into all sorts of tricky territory. Obviously, equities, ownership, onward transmission, all that stuff. Cyber, by and large, doesn't, which is what makes sort of trusted cooperation with reasonably reliable countries easier, and actually makes collaboration with the private sector easier. There are some spectacular exceptions that you will be well aware of, both with industry and vulnerabilities and that sort of thing, and with other governments. But by and large, when you took those first tentative steps a bit more into the open, it tended to lead to more, not to retrenchment. Anyway,
was there an aspect? I mean, like, one of the things you've worked on for years is what you call value-based government.
Yeah.
Is it? Would you say? Actually, let me just challenge you a little bit with my painful thoughts, which is, I've always said that it's very hard when the signals intelligence agencies and the cyber teams have different values inherent in their culture than the rest of the government. And so when you see like in the United States, and it's hard not to compare the UK and the United States in some senses, even though it's usually a mistake. But like in the United States, right? Like the cyber teams have their own particular cultures, and then you have like the cop style teams from like the FBI, for example, that have a very different culture, that come from a very different lineage. And if I was coming out of big government, shall we say, I feel like some of that stuff would be eye-opening in a way. I don't know if you found that similar in your experience.
So I think coming from sort of what you might call mainstream government into an intelligence agency, that is a hell of a sort of transformation of culture. I mean, there is something, and it sounds a bit twee, and to some extent it is, but there's truth to it. There is this thing. I mean, I rarely heard the word mission in my first 17 years of my non-intelligence agency career. Yeah. Then all of a sudden, everybody was about the mission. That's mostly a positive, gives you a real sort of sense of purpose. The challenge with it, particularly in a secret organization, is that the mission can become self-defining. Now, I don't want to stress that too much in sort of out of control state and so on, because actually British laws of governing the responsible conduct of intelligence are far, far tighter than they were 2 generations ago. Barely existed 2 generations ago, and it was all done on political sort of control. But they're pretty tight. But just in terms of, if you take cyber, and this is a fairly mundane point, but it's an important one for me anyway. There was a sense, I think, in the pre-NCSC days that the priorities were what we were interested in, whether or not they matched to the country or not. I think 2 things there. One is, there's a much better system now for saying, look, this is the way the government's out. I mean, for example, the finite resources and the protection of critical infrastructure. What do you really want from this? And you get sort of direction on that. But also, I think something I was pretty hot on, hopefully mostly successfully, was look, this may be extremely intellectually interesting, operationally interesting, but in terms of, in terms of its value to the country, in terms of, the needs of the people, businesses, and all the rest of it, is it any use? So something that I think I got wrong for a lot of the time when I was there, and probably only partially corrected, was that, nation state stuff is in a sense, defending against that, getting ahead of it, whatever, blocking, the APTs, essential, fundamental, but actually quite cool. People get excited about that sort of thing operationally. Dull cybercrime, nah, less so. But as we've seen, in terms of impact, economic, social, disruptive stuff, maybe not strategically in the same way as ABTs, but in terms of, if part of your remit, which it is just the general sort of digital health of the economy, then the criminal stuff's massive. And just saying, look, I'm sorry, I know it's not as interesting as some of these sort of new APTs, but we've got to, we've got to get a deeper understanding of the ransomware groups, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's sort of quite interesting. Just on your Dave, on your sort of culture points, I think the sort of Intel v cybersecurity is a bit like in the US, relatively unproblematic, because there's the poacher gamekeeper thing, and people all the way from Turing have done both throughout their careers, and that sort of part of the deal. The law enforcement thing's quite interesting. So we had to we came to a useful, but after tricky start, sort of accommodation with the major national police forces, because culturally they're attuned to treating all of this as crime. You aim to prosecute things to evidential standard, et cetera, and certainly in our system, under it was clarified in a famous court judgment in 1968. The operational discretion of the police is total. You cannot, no public authority from the Prime Minister down can tell the police to stop an investigation or to start an investigation. It's entirely the police's decision. But so you've got to have an honest, but you can only do it through persuasion and partnership. You've got to have an honest discussion with them that, look, if there is, for example, an extremely sophisticated Russian espionage operation and you detect it, then you have to have a priority call about, who gets primacy here? Is it the law enforcement investigation of what is technically a crime and under British law, despite the fact that A, that's not going to help with mitigation, and B, you're not going to see anybody in a court anytime soon? Or do you do something else? So we set up, mechanisms for that, whereby, under the sort of gold command arrangements that you have in the UK, sometimes it'd be early on, the NCSC would lead, and actually in quite a lot of the higher end cases, the NCSC would lead, law enforcement would be there. But all the times, if it was, look, actually, here's a group of British criminals, or, when we were in the EU, French criminals, because you had the European arrest warrant, or in the US, and actually they're doing some harm and there's a reasonable chance of getting them, then you'd say, right, you guys have primacy, off you go, do your thing. And any work the NCSC will do, will endeavor to do it to an evidential standard to support you.
So, I mean, there's a lot there, actually. But one of the things that's come up recently is obviously the UK's position on international law. I know you have a lawfare piece on that. We should paste it into the Twitch channel. And by the way, Twitch stream, if you have questions for our honored guest, please paste them through. And I want to ask you about that. We actually got a hot question though before that, which is, how has leaving the EU changed the Oregon mission? I don't know if you can actually answer that, but
I'll give it a go. So, when the vote happened and there had been no contingency planning done for a leave vote, government goes through an exercise saying all public authorities tell us, how you're affected by this. Ours was very minimal, because, whatever, the arguments may have been about the apparent total control of the EU over British law and government. Actually, Article 4 of the Treaties of the European Union says national security is exempt. GCHQ, which the NCCC was clearly a national security organisation. So apart from things like the membership of ENISA, the EU standards body, there are some EU institutions like the Intelligence Centre, CERT-EU, but actually the UK has a relatively strong cyber security machine within the EU. Was sort of a net sponsor of that rather than a net recipient of it. So it barely affected it at all in terms of what we could do. But I always said, if you were in intelligence, that was very different from being in law enforcement. So law enforcement had affected it profoundly. Data sharing. So data sharing between intelligence services in the European continent is I would call it voluntarily, informally multilateral. So, you have bilateral arrangements with the French, which, were very good and remain very good despite all the tensions. You might have little groups of, like-minded, capable countries who just get together informally with no formal governance and say, look, can we work together on this, that, the other? But law enforcement, it was very, very different, actually. And then, so that was the sort of short term, could we do, so it's probably three things. In the immediate term, it didn't really change the legal and operational basis of what we did at all, but it did for law enforcement. I have to say that, you build strong relationships and you try and shield them from, political turmoil. And look, you wouldn't believe me if I said that, there were no difficulties between, senior politicians in different countries. Of course there were. It was pretty horrible, but as best as possible, operational leaders did their best to, because we never fell out over security issues. So, there's no reason not to cooperate, and we did our best, but it was a little bit more difficult. And then the third thing, which hasn't matured yet, and so we won't know for a while, is the long-term basis of things like, data governance laws in, digital trade laws. How will that affect the relationship between the UK and the EU? And they're not really mature enough yet. I mean, the UK hasn't really diverged, but it's a big political issue. We're about to have a change of prime minister. There'll be a general election in 2024 or earlier. That if the UK and the EU start to diverge in terms of digital governance significantly, then that still won't change GCHQ or the NCSC's powers, but it will change the nature of the digital economy that they're trying to protect.
That's a great point, actually. That I want to clip that and highlight it, actually. We have a couple more questions. Pablo, do you want to ask these questions? Because I don't know how to frame the last one especially.
Yeah, no, it's just an interesting perspective. So I'll claim some amount of ignorance as to the authorities of the intelligence community in the UK, vice the military. I know one of the challenges in the US is, as Dave mentioned, it's not just the kind of standards, but the missions, right? The missions between the intelligence community and the military and the law enforcement often conflict.
Yeah.
And in your discussion so far, you've not mentioned the military. So I was wondering how that relationship works in the UK.
Okay. So probably two or 3 points on that. The first is that there is a fundamental difference because of the different constitutional setups between the way the UK and the US system works. So the way to bring that home is, if you're new in, say, the British intelligence services and you go and meet your American counterparts, one of the things you find baffling is you meet an American colleague, and within the first few minutes, the American colleague will start reciting. I'm not criticizing, quite enjoyed this, but they'd start reciting under what specific authority they were operating, Title 10, whatever, presidential order, whatever the one with 222 is, the one, et cetera, right? UK organizations don't operate like that. You have a general broad statutory permission, and unless you're contravening that, you can, I don't mean this sort of recklessly, but you can do what you want. You don't have to cite and invoke a specific authority. So to that end, the reason I mentioned that, Pablo, is it's not quite as complicated as it can be in the US, just to figure it out. That's not to say there aren't challenges. The second thing is, I think, actually in the 102-year history of 103-year history of GCHQ, cybersecurity is the first time it's led on anything. It's always been a supporting function, right? So, it's support to counterterrorism and so on, but its origins historically are support to military operations. And it's basically what it did. So 10% of the NCSE, certainly at the time I left, was devoted to the security of military systems. So there is this sort of established relationship, essentially as a sort of junior partner of the InfoSec part of GCHQ through the NCSE is a sort of junior partner in a military relationship. So you're sort of used to working with them. Where it gets complicated, and it is complicated now, and it's complicated legally and operationally. It's workable, but it's complicated, is sort of cyber operations. So the system the UK works off a system of authorizations. Essentially, somebody writes a paper to a cabinet minister and says, look, the way the law works, this is a slight cartoon, but it's just about accurate enough for the purposes of a brief discussion. Says, look, under the Intelligence Services Act or the Investigatory Powers Act 2016, we think we can do this operation. The law essentially says, because the underlying activity is unlawful unless explicitly authorized. Minister, do you agree that this is, necessary, proportionate, etc., under all the tests in the law? So for MI5 operations, that tends to be the Home Secretary, the Interior Minister, whatever, unless it's in Northern Ireland, in which case it's the Northern Ireland Secretary. For GCHQ, historically, it's been the Foreign Secretary because it's a foreign intelligence organization. And so, cyber operations, and I'm talking, what we now call offensive cyber, what we would have called effects since the 90s and noughties, they would have gone to the Foreign Secretary. Now, because of the UK set up something called the National Cyber Force, which is the closest equivalent the UK has to Cyber Command. But the difference between it and Cyber Command, and it's different from the NCSC, which is explicitly just a part of GCHQ. It's a sort of joint construct between military and intelligence. So essentially, if it's a military operation, so if there was a state of formal war between the UK and another power, all these operations would go through the Defence Secretary. If it looks like a military operation, then it'll go through the Defence Secretary. If it looks like a traditional in inverted commas, effects operation, it'll go through the Foreign Secretary. As you can imagine, and this wasn't my side of the house, if you like, so I don't really know the details. And obviously, even if I did, I couldn't speak to the actual details. I can speak to the framework. You can imagine that within that framework, there's quite a lot of scope for ambiguity where you have to have mechanisms to sort of thrash things out. But again, to go back to the first point I made, you do that kind of sort of informally through sort of ad hoc discussions rather than, the sort of deeply sort of legally technical discussions that seem to happen in the US.
No, that's a great response, and I appreciate that. I will say I'm often jealous of my UK brothers and sisters. I had cases when I was still working for government where legally I was not allowed to do things, and somebody from the UK was poking me, going, "Ask me to do it. We can do it." Unfortunately, my lawyers had issues with that, and I was at the wrong end of that discussion several times. The other thing that I will say that I think that I would like to highlight from your response is the relationship between the intelligence community and the military for effects, because I refuse to call it OCO, I prefer effects, is much better. I think the intelligence community, as wonderful as they are in the UK, really realizes that they're primarily there as a supporting function to operations. That's not necessarily the case in the US.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, I lost you for a bit. So I heard you say you refused to call them effects, but
no, I refuse to call it OCO. I much prefer effects.
Oh, you much prefer effects. Yeah, no, I think I'm broadly in that. I'm broadly in that line as well. Actually, I think in the context of what we might come on to at some point on Ukraine, I think we're sort of forgetting that sometimes as well.
Absolutely. G, you had a question.
No. I was curious about the UK's military cyber capacity, and since the US has like cybercom as a complete thing, but they don't have, for example, like the cyber force as a branch of the military. Is the UK like how are they approaching it?
Well, so I mean, cybercom's much older than the National Cyber Force. The National Cyber Force was announced in 2020. And like I say, it is it is a joint military and intelligence capability. It's envisaged to grow to, I think the public figure is 3,000, but that's over 10 years, and a lot of that will be military. But I think historically, defense hasn't had that capability. So the sort of, and I went through this with the NCSC in a different context, the sort of inherited capability will be initially sort of GCHQ, and the governance of it is pretty complicated. So if you look at every year, there's a sort of joint meeting of cyber leadership between the UK and the US, and one of the interesting things about it is that, notwithstanding the relative size of the organizations, because of course the dual hat in the US, General Nakasone essentially is on his own as the leader of the UK delegation. His counterparts the US delegation, his counterparts from the US are the director of GCHQ and somebody called Commander Strategic Command, which is basically what we used to call the joint services part of the British military. So it's the exact opposite of dual hatting. Now, if you went in the US to to split the dual hat, it would still not map over completely because the equivalent of the US, and sorry to be so complicated and nerdy about this, but the British model would be in US terms would be if you split the dual hat and had an independent commander of cyber command, it would be like the joint direct. It would be the head of cyber, the military head of cyber command, and the director of the NSA would be jointly responsible for cyber command. That's the way the UK system sort of works at the minute.
That sounds very efficient and well thought out. I'm sure that will serve you guys well.
Well, not my problem anymore. But there you
go. We had one question from the audience. How has the relationship with Denmark changed over the last couple of years? Presumably this is about Greenland and the sovereignty of that one island that everyone keeps complaining about between the Canadians, and I've got no idea. I don't know what.
I don't know. I mean, if it was a live audience, I'd ask them to be a bit more specific, because to my knowledge, I mean, I'm literally out of government 2 years next week, so I can safely dodge the question. To my knowledge, not very much at all. I mean, the Danes, in cybersecurity terms, like a lot of Northern Europe, are pretty sort of competent.
And Dane Geld and they go away, right? That's the
we don't even have to pay them that. Don't even have to pay them that anymore. So honestly, I'm sorry, but I like to answer honestly. One of the things that I always got me through the NCSC days was never to answer a question I didn't know.
Let me throw this is a very generic question that every single person in government gets,
sure.
Or post-government. And I want to try to drive it to something very specific. But when you look at building cyber power, a huge part of that is attracting and keeping staff. And in the UK's case, it's also about drastically growing staff, right? You're staffing out this military organization, which I think honestly is going to be
hackers. That's going to be, I mean, how do you?
It's a rough call. I think we've talked about this before as well. But do you see the UK as having a particular strength or weakness when it comes to structuring this particular part of the problem?
So I think there's a mixture of positives and negatives. So one of the things was, I remember being told when we were trying to sort of push the idea of the NCSC and the sort of more interventionist mission, several people who were well-intentioned and supportive said, look, there are not enough skills. And I did think there was a certain amount of Cassandra-ness about skills at the time. This would be like sort of the mid-20 teens, where I remember just thinking, well, look, honestly, you pursue this argument to its logical conclusion, you just don't do anything. And there were GCHQ has got a history of attracting and retaining really, really good people. And part of that, it tries to be a bit more flexible and pay. It can't compete with the private sector, but it can, certainly offer slightly more generous terms sometimes in recognition of specialist skills. Also, they did some quite clever things, give sort of skills framework, which, you get more money if you are at this level or that level and so on, which, I mean, gives people financial incentives, but also gives people actually a career structure and a bit of, validation and that sort of thing. There is, of course, the fact that we do get really, really interesting work. So, attrition rates were manageable in my time. I think, obviously in my time we didn't have a serious recession or inflationary pressures. So, I think I'd be obviously concerned about that now. I also think that, there is a much remarked sort of political debate in this country at the minute about short-termism. You know, there's sort of infrastructure project crises, and people are digging up quotes from 2010 about, you know, water and energy facilities saying, no, we're not going to build them in 2010 because they won't be online until 2022, and it is 2022 now, and that sort of thing. So there is something happening, but probably too slowly in terms of the education system and STEM skills and that sort of thing, which, you know, will bear fruit in a decade or two if we keep at it and sustain it. And if we don't, we'll be in trouble. Because
that's a great point, because you do not realistically see that here sometimes, right? Like the United States education system is a long forgotten tree in the corner of the yard. And then in college, we try to, like, you know, upskill people, or, you know, like,
yeah.
So it's very interesting to hear that perspective.
Well, I'll give you an interesting example. So, but it's I sort of preface it with saying that it's only scratching the surface. So we did all this study on, you know, sort of cyber labor market, and you've got the classic problem. So, for example, the fact that there's so the fact that the female population is so badly underrepresented. So you say, well, what's the reason for that? And you look at the current workforce, and then you look at the sort of relevant disciplines and say, graduations from universities, and you notice that actually people studying the relevant subjects, there's a huge gender imbalance. So it doesn't start at working age, it starts earlier. So when does it start? So remember, we started these competitions called Cyber First Girls, basically hacking competitions or incident response competitions and that sort of thing. Now, as stressed, they're small scale. You know, you get maybe, you know, a few thousand every few years through it. And we started off at sort of, you know, 16 to 18 level. And then we looked at that, and actually, even then, in terms of the relevant subjects and interests in, you know, in hacking and computer security technology, it was still huge underrepresentation of girls. So we went earlier, and we ended up running the competition for 11 to 13-year-olds. To get them interested, and then with their permission and their school's permission and their parents' permission, you keep a list, you keep them in touch, you invite them to summer camps and that sort of thing. Now, the problem is, in a country of 70 million people, this is only a few thousand. So, you know, we've been doing that for enough years that we're actually starting to get some of these people through, and we're doing all the things such as, you know, running camps for 18, 19-year-olds who aren't going to university, but if they show initiative and application, you know, they get on a 6-week training camp, and sometimes they get jobs at the end of that and that sort of thing. Again, useful for the government specialist workforce. There's enough there to make a difference, not useful enough for the economy as a whole. So you can, so I would say in conclusion, you know, there are bits and pieces the government can do to make sure its own workforce just about gets by in the short term and medium term, but the long term stuff, you just have to think about, you know, what sort of skills pipeline you've got. So it's a really difficult problem. I think, you know, I probably risk sounding a bit complacent because it was okay when I was there, not because I was there, but because the economy was basically fine. I think now we're going to see a real stretch. And that'll be a real in terms of, you know, particularly people attracting people to government.
Is Industry 100 under NCSC?
Yeah, that was our idea. It came from it was really interesting. There's a guy who's now president of something called the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry. It's the business lobby group. At the time, he was just the chairman of a big company, and he had been on non-executive boards in government, and he was interested in cybersecurity. And so he and I had a conversation, and he said, you know what? He said, you know, you need more industry. Well, I said, yeah, but, you know, wages, security clearance, and so on. He said, no, look, I would pay out of my large company's budget, I would pay for somebody to come and spend 2 years with you guys. I would pay for it. I said, that's a really interesting concept. So we launched this thing where, you know, as long as you pay, so obviously it does favor larger employers who can afford it. As long as you pay, you can, and, you know, security clearances are there, and we can manage conflicts of interest, et cetera, you can come in. So that's where that came from. The real benefit to the government and to the NCSC was, you know, we went through this thing where, you know, and again, this was a sort of thing we're trying to address in moving from the old arrangements to the NCSC. It's particularly important in critical industries and critical infrastructure. You know, if you're going to give guidance to the energy sector, well, who in the NCSC knows anything about the business and operational realities of the energy sector? Nobody. So if an energy company says, well, we'll send in one of our cybersecurity team for 2 years, even if part-time, it's great, because they'll say, look, that's fine. You went through this with the banking sector, because the Bank of England had, it was the sort of pioneer, the sort of, you know, the regulator of banks. It said, look, you know, post the financial crash, it's got a statutory mandate for operational resilience. It interpreted that to include cybersecurity. Sounds fair enough. And then it said to us, right, can you help us with some cybersecurity regulations? We said, sure. We wrote some and they said, well, that might work for cybersecurity. It'll probably bankrupt every bank or, destroy the financial model. We said, okay, well, what would work? And you come to, so you need, I mean, the virtue of Industry 100, apart from just getting the experience and the diversity of skills in, is you get people who understand the environment in which this lands, which was really helpful.
Would you call it a pretty big success?
So as proof of concept, yes. In terms of specific impacts in particular areas, yes. Strategically, I would be a bit self-critical about scale and just making it feel like a really primary part of the NCC. I probably didn't push it hard enough.
Is there anything else that you wish you would have pushed a lot harder while you were there?
I think two things. One is the counter-criminal stuff. I do think just in terms of impact, it's massive. Yeah, it's less interesting than nation state stuff. But I remember being challenged by my Australian counterpart. Who said, compare what we know about the major nation state APTs versus the major international criminal cartels. And there's an absolute chasmic difference in my day, certainly. I imagine it's changed a bit, not least because of the 2021 ransomware crisis. But, if I'd pushed it harder, maybe the 2021 ransomware crisis might have at least been a little bit less than it was. The other thing is that I think I didn't, so it's not something I should have pushed harder, maybe something I should have pushed back against. GCHQ, and particularly the NCSC within it, was, got, I hope, a merited reputation for having, at a time when a lot of people were criticizing the state and state capacity for being useless and not having the right skills and capabilities, it did have really proper, internationally renowned expertise. And one of the challenges of that was, it became a sort of go-to for any sort of technology policy problem in government. And in particular, if you take, so the last 2 years of my time there were dominated by, unusually, because normally one of the virtues of the job was it was in the sweet spot politically, and that it was important but not really politically controversial. Then my last 2 years was all about 5G and whether Huawei would have limited involvement and so forth. Now, whatever your views on that, the point is that actually isn't really primarily a cybersecurity issue. It's a foreign policy issue. It's an economic and trade issue. All the stuff about the fact that the telecoms infrastructure provider market had collapsed over the course of 20 years. That wasn't the fault of hackers or a failure of cybersecurity. That was about the structure of Western economies and the Chinese economy. The policy levers for that are not to be found in the NCSC. And I do remember, for example, at one point, be mildly careful about sort of sourcing this, I won't give too much detail, but in a high level meeting, people saying, looking at me and my colleagues saying, you need to work with our international partners to make sure that, there are alternatives to Huawei. I'm like, you mean a part of GCHQ? Who should we work with? What, the NSA to create a telecoms infrastructure?
That would be far more acceptable for all of NSA came out and said, don't use Huawei, use NSA brand telecom. And you see that working on the market. I think that was it's a missed opportunity right there.
I don't like in government when people say that's not my job, but it was not our job to stop the closure of Nortel or the disappearance of Alcatel-Lucent or anything. That's not what.
Well, some people attribute those failures to a concerted Chinese plan where Nortel in particular, in theory, was hacked, their IP was taken, and then they were competed against by lower priced Chinese competitors.
So Nortel is
which is a strategic operation that lasts decades on the part of the Chinese.
Yes. So Nortel is probably the poorest example because there is a big cybersecurity dimension to that, but a lot of the rest of it, the fragmentation of the Western telecoms market, not just at infrastructure level, but at operator level, was
going out of it. Like Lucent, like everyone, they stopped treating it as an important thing, right? And that was visible at the 5G meetings where China would have 20 engineers and there'd be like one guy from Ericsson and one guy from Nokia, coming up with the protocols, and then suddenly like 5 years later, when like all of the protocols are being like specced out, everyone's like, oh my God, how did China get so far ahead of us? It's like, well, they cared, you know?
So here would be my example. If you take last year, we had the chair of the G7, and there's a summit in Cornwall in the summer, and there are two bits of it that are relevant to this discussion. So there's a big declaration on ransomware, we're going to do this, that, and the other. So what happens as a result of that, and you can criticize its implementation, whatever, but basically security agencies can be tasked to work together, pool intelligence, look at capabilities, look at disruptions, we even look at regulation and cryptocurrency. There's a sort of infrastructure for making something happen, right? Just like if there's a NATO summit, there's an infrastructure for making things happen. It may not happen very well, but there's an infrastructure for making things happen. There's then a declaration that's really interesting and really well written about, the challenge of Chinese tech to the free and open internet-based technology, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to work together to, make sure that the Western model of free and open tech is competitive and, survives and so forth. Well, who does that? Which bits of government across the G7 are responsible for that? That's what I'm saying. And I'm not being critical of governments. I'm just saying, you don't remit that to cybersecurity agencies, or certainly not SIGINT agencies. It's a really difficult, and you don't delegate it to ministries of defense. It's a really difficult public policy problem. It's mostly economic, and I think that's one of the things that we could have sort of pushed a bit harder.
But let me sum up your career very briefly here, which is you got pulled into cyber because cyber became important.
Yeah,
right? Like,
I think that's fair.
And I think the reality is, like, it became important in a way people, for some reason, did not predict, and very suddenly in a way. There was almost a phase change. So now cyber is important at all these tables, right? It's important for the economic stuff, the security stuff, for all the other issues. And you're here to like talk about like, when you build an alliance that's this complicated, here's the 16 things that are going to hit us first, and the structures we need, and the things that will protect us later when we decide we actually need to open the doors even further.
I might pay you to update my resume, Dave. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
But maybe I should. I think the other thing about GCHQ is they were very early with getting on GitHub, for example.
Yeah.
And so I feel like there was a little aspect of them that, like in 2016, I think they were on GitHub with really good stuff. I was like, oh my gosh, a graph database. That's very interesting, right? Like,
I mean, CyberChef, like their tool I use every single day. So
yeah, in a way, the UK has been a leader here.
Well, thanks. And I don't. So that sort of stuff around GitHub and so on, that predated me because there already was that sort of opening up. The first thing, you get your induction, all the rest of it. I remember, I must have seen 500 PowerPoint slides that week, but one of the few I remember was somebody showed me a graph. Here's our budget, here's the global IT industry. We're not going to control it. We're not going to, make direct strategic impact. You have to, I hate the word, but you have to leverage it. You have to work it, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's a middle bar about here's the estimated, here's the cybersecurity industry within the global IT industry, which obviously dwarfed GCHQ's cybersecurity capability. So that's where all that came from.
I think, honestly, in the States, that presentation has not been seen, right? So a lot of our policies often still think we are the driver of advanced technology, as opposed to, which we used to be, right? The United States defense industrial base used to be the forefront of all modern radios and all sorts of equipment that, like, all advanced technology, because they were the main customer. And now they're a tiny micro niche customer in that huge industry. And that's not an adjustment that, say, export control has really understood yet.
Right. Like, I think the perfect example here is like AWS was not built for DoD and then made available to the public later on. Right. It went the other way. Like AWS was built internally, made available. And at some point, DoD said, we need some of this cloud thing. And they went to the commercial sector for that.
It's completely upended, right? As a matter of fact, we've had numerous failed instances of US DoD trying to figure out, hey, how do we catch up or even work with industry? And industry goes, you know what? There's just not enough money to make the effort of working with US DoD worthwhile.
I think it's a really interesting set of points. And actually, when you were talking, I mean, the thing that I couldn't stop thinking about was the history of sort of cryptography. And I mean, it went from the exclusive preserve of governments to something where governments actually now are frightened of some of its implications. I mean, I love, if you ever read my friend Gordon Greer, the BBC security correspondent, if you read his sort of, Intercept book, the history of spies and computers, the chapter on the, Diffie and Hellman meet the NSA is just incredible, and that whole bit where the realization that, look, okay, this thing that for, 30 years has been the big government secret and the thing you do, and now it is becoming democratized, popularized, and eventually it's going to be beyond the control of governments, at least huge parts of it. Absolutely fascinating, and I think that's one of the, it's the same principle, isn't it? But it's really, really interesting.
Well, it's been really fascinating watching. Historically, international law has been built off the Westphalian model of the nation state.
Yeah.
And the instruments of national power being diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. And if you look at those instruments, almost all of them have been democratized by technology at this point, right? The ability to reach a mass populace, which used to belong to heads of state and the church. Katy Perry has 50 times the number of followers as the Prime Minister of Britain. The power to print money. You've got Bitcoin and cryptocurrency.
BTS has got 40 to 50 million people that they can task to do a thing, who will do a thing. Like, right. That is essentially, they've got like the population of the UK online, and they can just say, do this thing for us, and they will. Like, that is amazing power. And BTS is like, I don't know, it's 8 dudes in like Korea. Like, the times have changed significantly, and it's certainly a brave new world. We've got a few minutes left before we have to close out. So, Ciaran, do you have anything that you want to tell us, maybe about the Scottish referendum, and the how was it speaking with 17 countries to get them to sign off on allowing girls to be king? Or,
well, the latter bit was really interesting because so this is just so weird, but because Queen Elizabeth II, or Queen Elizabeth I, as the Scots will insist on calling her, has been around for so long, was basically crowned in still just about the days of empire. Now, the position of the Queen, for example, as Queen of Australia, is entirely voluntary. I mean, Barbados ditched it last year. So to move the laws, and Buckingham Palace were always absolutely incorrectly insistent on this, you needed the formal agreement of all, at the time, 17 countries. So you couldn't just change it. People in Britain thought it was just a UK thing. You couldn't. That's what made it so complicated and hard to do. So David Cameron's target was to announce it at a Commonwealth Heads of Government Summit in 2011. And meetings had been held, the Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, and so forth, with whom you'd have very established and deep relationships. That was unproblematic. I mean, there were difficulties, political handling difficulties in those countries, but they got through them. A lot of the other realms, as they're called, just didn't engage, because why would they? They didn't want to, and some of them are tiny. So the one I would always remember, are places like Tuvalu, where eventually we just had to say, look, please, are you okay with this? Because we can't go ahead without you. We don't really care. And eventually we got an email, basically I think it was a Yahoo account, which we checked out. And it was, from somebody authoritative in the government of Tuvalu, which arrived I think it was going to be announced on a Monday, and it arrived in the middle of the Saturday night because of time zone differences, and we went, yep, that'll do. And the final confirmation, because we had this list, countries ticked, where's the formal letter of consent, etc., all there, and we were just waiting on a handful. Furious diplomatic efforts just to say, look, we know this isn't contentious, but could you do it, and so forth. The Scottish thing, if we talk about things that you regret or didn't get right, one of my sort of self-deprecating jokes and remarks is, my career involved setting the terms for a free, legal, and fair and decisive referendum on Scottish independence in 2014, and that put the issue to bed, didn't it?
Well, I mean, I know that we're just on time, but I want to really thank you for coming on. And this may be an American thing, but I also really want to just thank you for your service, because the ability to create large sort of scale coherence and agreements between vastly different parties is something that we needed. And I think you stepped in right in time. And I just really appreciate that this happened, right? Like that change was able to be sort of, taken cleanly through the system
Anyone
as
who can
opposed to
get
being a
the
fight.
Tuvalu government to sign off on the Queen can set up some little, international cybersecurity whatever thing.
Well, these
this is
problems aren't
what
going
it was
away.
about coalition building.
Coalition building is a literal skill that is in sore demand. So thank you so much for doing that. And thank you so much for doing this.
For
Oh,
coming on.
thank you for
because-
inviting me. It's a great group, so thank you so much.
Cool. So that's going to be it. Bye, everyone. Remember to coalition build the subscribe button, and Industry 100 the comments, and smash that like.
And like and subscribe to the Kim Zetter.
Right.
Definitely. That's brilliant.
This has been Kim Zetter News Hour Glasshouse Discussion Hour. Kim Zetter's newsletter, Glasshouse Hour Discussion. Thank you. I'll get it right eventually.